All right, so review 1.5 is going to go over adding and subtracting of decimals. Now, when I first taught it to you, I teach it always the same way. Anytime we have decimals and fractions, we have to add questions on how we know to do them and set them up. So at the top of your paper, that's what you see, and I want you to fill in this information. So you have three different questions that you'd always ask when you're doing adding and subtracting of decimals. Now, what is my first step? What is my second step? What is my third step? And my first step is lining things up. And then my second step is filling things in. And then my third step is doing something with the decimal once I'm set up. So what am I lining up? Well, I'm lining up the decimals. And if there's a whole number without a decimal, then I add a decimal so I can line it up with my other decimals. What am I filling in? Well, I'm filling in with zeros. If there's any of them, let's say one of them has 4 decimal positions and one of them only has 1 decimal position. Then I have 3 decimal positions that I need to fill in with zeros so that everything is lined up according to their place values. And then finally, before I do the adding or subtracting, then I bring down my decimals. So number 1, I don't forget it. Or number 2, when I then try to remember where it's supposed to go, I don't forget. So this is, I just summed up basically a lot of the different steps. The way I teach it, they just make it a little bit more wordy, but they're showing you the same setup and examples. So we're going to jump right into the practice problems. So I have 62.38 or 62 and 38 hundredths. I'm adding 26 and 92 hundredths. So I do my 3 things. First, I line up my decimals. Well, they're already lined up for me, so that makes it pretty easy. 2, fill in with zeros. I don't have any. 3, bring down my decimals. So that's where I have to start. I have to remember to bring down my decimals, the third one tells me, so that it's there and ready for me to then add. Then I just add my place value. 8 and 2 is 10, so I put down a 0 and I carry a 1. 9 and 1 is 10 plus 3 is 13, so I put down a 3 and carry a 1 again. 6, 2, and 1 makes 9, add those, and 6 and 2 is 8. Now, here's the thing that you need to remember anytime you're writing a decimal. If it's zeros at the end of my decimal number, I get rid of them unless it's money and I have a 0 in my hundredths position. Okay? So if there's something in the dimes position, the tenths position, then I have to have a 0. If it's just like $13, I don't need to have 0.00. I can just have the $13 with the dollar sign and I'm good to go. So I have to make sure that I cross off that 0 before I write down my final answer. So my final answer then is just 89 and 3/10. On number 2, line up my decimals, done for me. Fill in with zeros. I don't have any to fill in. Bring down my decimal. So that's going to be my step 1. I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to put it right below where it is because everything's lined up. I know I'm going to then have my place values correct. Remember, if I check my sign, because this is going to be adding and subtracting, I got to make sure I do the right one. This is subtracting. So 8 minus 1 is just 7. And then 2 minus 4, can't do that because if I have 2 fingers, I can't take 4 from it. Okay, so I know I have to borrow. So when I borrow from the 8, it becomes 7, and therefore my 2 becomes 12. Now I can take 4 from 12. 12 minus 4 gives me 8. And then 7 minus 9, can't take 9 fingers from 7 fingers. So once again, I have to borrow. My 4 becomes a 3. My 7 becomes a 17. 17 minus 9 is going to give me 8. I have a 3 left over. Bring it down. So I have 38 and 87 hundredths as my final answer. Adding. Now, lining up decimals. They've already been nice to you, and they haven't lined up correctly. But if it was like written out in a number sentence, kind of like your homework is tonight, that would just been a 52 by itself. You have to remember to put a decimal at the end of your whole number so that you don't get confused as to where it goes. Then my decimal positions would line up. So when I bring down my decimal positions, I know I have my decimals lined up. I added it to the 52. I filled in with zeros because there wasn't anything behind it. And then I bring my decimal down. So I have all 3 steps done. Then I just do my adding. 4 plus nothing plus 4 gives me 8. 0, 0, 4 gives me 4. 6, 2, and 1 gives me 9. And 8, 5, and 1 gives me a total of 14. So I know my final answer is 149 and 48 hundredths. Now, if I'm going too fast, just pause the video as you're working through it, showing your work. Okay, because you have to show your work as well as have an answer, or you can't get credit for showing your work. 4. already lined up for me. They've done step 1. I don't need a step 2 because I both have 2 decimal positions. So 3, I got to bring my decimal down. Once I bring my decimal down, then this one's subtracting. I can subtract. 9 minus 9 gives me a 0. So 2 minus 3, I can't take 3 from 2, so I have to borrow from the 7. 7 becomes 6, my 2 becomes 12. 12 minus 3 gives me a 9. 6 minus 9, no, can't take 9 from 6, so I have to borrow again. My 2 becomes a 1, and my 6 becomes a 16. 16 minus 9 then gives me 7. I have a 1 and a 1. Well, 1 minus 1 is a 0, and I don't put zeros in the front of my numbers. So I just have 7.90, but once again, not going to have that 0 at the end because it's not money. So I'm just going to have an answer of 7 and 9/10. So that's our first 4 practice problems, but now we have a couple that are written as number sentences. Remember, sentences go across. So the first thing I have to do is I'm going to actually have to make sure I stack all of these correctly. So when I stack them then, I have to figure out where my decimals are and make sure they line up. So I did 1, I lined up my decimals. Fill in with zeros. This one needs a 0 above the 7, so I have all the place values held. So I have my 0, and then I brought my decimal down. Now I can subtract. So when I subtract, I borrow from my 5, which is a 4, and my 0 becomes 10, and 10 minus 7 gives me a remainder of 3. 4 minus 8, can't do it. Got to borrow from my 3. My 3 becomes 2, my 4 becomes 14, and then I have 14 minus 8. 14 minus 8 is 6. Come over here, 2 minus 2. I can do that, that's 0, pretty basic. 4 minus 6, can't do it. Got to borrow again, 7 becomes 6, my 4 becomes 14, and then I can subtract. 14 minus 6 gives me 8, and then I have my 6 minus 4, which is 2. Do I have any zeros to drop off there at the end? Nope, it ends with a 3. So I have 280 and 63 hundredths as my final answer. Adding, still have to go through my first 3 steps. I have to line up my decimals first, so I stack them. Now it doesn't matter which one you put on top or bottom when it comes to addition, but the subtraction, I must put the first one on top. It's going to give me a completely wrong answer if I switch those around. Adding, it really doesn't matter. I just routinely put my first number on top so I don't have to mess it up. They're stacked according to decimals. I fill in with zeros and drop down my decimal. So now I have 3 decimal positions in each. My decimal's in the right place down below where I'm going to do my work. And then all I have to do is add. 0 and 3 is 3. 1 and 0 is 1. 0 and 0 is 0. All right. 8 and 2. Well, 8 and 2 is 10. Carry my 1. That gives me 1 plus 9 plus 5, which is 15. So my final answer for a 6 would be 150 and 13 thousandths, or 0.013. And then finally, I have to stack them. Once again, the first one, especially in subtraction, has to be on top. So I line them up according to decimals. Notice I got a couple spaces I have to fill in there. So they're lined up correctly. I have my decimal that I bring down. I fill in with my zeros. I'm good to go. Now notice I did some crossing out already because I have a 0 up there and I cannot take 7 from nothing. So I know I have to borrow, and this is called borrowing through. I'm showing that I'm already going to borrow from that 0 also because it's not a whole number. So I'm actually borrowing from the 9, and then I have to borrow through on both of them. So my 9 becomes 8. This would be a 10, but I'm also borrowing from it. So it becomes a 9, and now my 0 can become a 10. If you prefer to show borrowing from the 9, it becomes 8. This becomes 10, crossing out the 10 and then making it a 9, then making the last one a 10. That works for me also. I just borrow through and I eliminate that one little step. Either way, as long as you get to the right answer, you're good to go. So 10 minus 7 is 3, 9 minus 2 is 7, and 8 minus 2 gives me 6. Now I can't borrow or can't subtract from the 6, so I have to borrow again for the 4. 7 becomes 6, and 4 becomes 14. Then I can subtract. 14 minus 6 gives me 8. 6 minus 1 gives me 5. So my final answer, I don't have any zeros to drop off, is 58 and 673 thousandths. Now this, we have to review the order of operations. Ask for several extra presents from my dear Aunt Sally. Absolute values, square roots, exponents, parentheses, which I have in both of those. Multiplication and division from left to right. Addition and subtraction from left to right. So when I look at this, this has a parentheses that has to start first, and then that one has a parentheses that has to start first. So I have to go to my parentheses first and solve for it. But remember, there's another step on 8 and 9 to do. So I do still the same setup. I line up my decimals, I bring down my decimal, I fill in with zeros, then I can add. So then I have 2 and 0 is 2, 5 and 2 is 7, 1 and 1 is 2, 7 and 5 gives me 12, so I have to carry my 1. 7 and 3 is 10 plus 1, so that's 11. I have to carry my 1 again. And that gives me 2 plus 1 is 3. Not my final answer. Because now I have to imagine that this was here where those parentheses are. So now I know I have to subtract 46 and 326 thousandths from it. So I have to show another subtraction problem or another problem. So I make sure I have it written down correctly, which I do. Line up my decimals from the one that's remaining. Don't have any decimals or zeros to fill in, so I bring my decimal down, and then I subtract. Now I've got to do some borrowing and everything else. I didn't put all of those steps on there, but I can't take from 6 from 2, so I borrow from my 7, which would give me 6 and 12. When I get here, well, I can't take from 3 from 2, so I got to borrow again. That would give me 1 and 12. And then I'd have to borrow again, and this would give me 0 and 12. And then I would have to borrow again, and this would give me 2 and 10. But when I type it into my handy-dandy calculator, it automatically does all that fancy stuff for me. So if I type this in, subtracting this and hit equals, I still get the right answer. This is what I need to see on your paper to know that you know what the next step is. And then your final answer with the decimal in the right place is 265 and 946 thousandths. So then on number 9, once again, ask for several extra presents, parentheses. I have to do that first. So I have an addition inside the parentheses, looks like I did here, but the work setup is going to be different because my last step, I have to take that from the one that's left. So I take the ones that are inside and I line them up. Now notice when I line them up, I got a couple spaces there. So there's a bigger space. I make sure the decimals are lined up first. That's my number one thing, and I bring them down. And then I fill in with zeros, and I make sure it all looks right. Lined up, zeros are filled in, decimals down, I can add now. So now I add 8 and 0 is 8, 1 and 0 is 1, 7 and 5 gives me 12. That leaves me with 1, 1 and 1. I can count on my 3 fingers. That gives me 3. Now this parentheses was at the back. So my next problem that I have to show my first one on top, always in subtraction, followed by then that answer. So I have the 11 and 24 thousandths, and I'm going to take away the 3 and 218 thousandths that I just found. My decimals are lined up. I don't have any zeros to fill in, so I bring my decimal down, and then I can use my handy-dandy calculator and just type it in, 11.024 minus 3.218, and then I see that my answer is 7.806. So my final answer should be 7 and 806 thousandths. So that's it. That's the lesson. It's pretty quick. It's under 15 minutes, as I told you I was going to strive to do. Okay. So just remember, when we're doing adding and subtracting, I can add and subtract decimals, but I have to make sure the decimals are lined up, that I have any zeros filled in that need to be, and then I bring my decimal down so it's in the right place. Then I just do the addition and subtraction. I have a couple of them for you on the back side where you have to have the order of operations in your head. You have to remember you have to do parentheses first before you do the next step, which just is one step. I was going to throw a whole bunch of them in there, but I thought I'd be nice and make them a little bit easier for you and not do all the different steps of the order of operations. We'll get to that here in about 2 weeks. So if you have any questions as you're working on it, come and ask. If not, should be a pretty good grade for all of you since it is review. Just make sure you follow along in the lesson in the video and you know what